Friends, this morning we are continuing our sermon series called Giving It Up. And in this sermon series, we are looking at things that we might give up for Lent. We started this series on Ash Wednesday when we talked about some of the things that we typically do give up for Lent, things like chocolate and ice cream and swearing and other vices. But in this series, we're looking at things going deeper. We're looking at those things, those behaviors that are destructive, that can affect our lives and the lives of the people around us. Last Sunday, we looked at giving up control. And if you missed that sermon, it is online. You can access it either through our website or by our Facebook page. And today, we are looking at giving up expectations. So I am reading this morning from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, verses 25 through 34 in the Common English Bible. It's part of the Sermon on the Mount. Therefore, I say to you, don't worry about your life, what you'll eat or what you'll drink, or about your body, what you'll wear. Isn't life more than food and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds in the sky. They don't sow seed or harvest grain or gather crops into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Aren't you worth much more than they are? Who among you, by worrying, can add a single moment to your life? And why do you worry about clothes? Notice how the lilies in the field grow. They don't wear themselves out with work, and they don't spin cloth. But I say to you that even Solomon in all his splendor wasn't dressed like one of these. If God dresses grass in the field so beautifully, even though it's alive today and tomorrow it's thrown into the furnace, won't God do much more for you, you people of weak faith? Therefore, don't worry and say, what are we going to eat? What are we going to drink? Or what are we going to wear? Gentiles long for all these things. Your heavenly Father knows that you need them. Instead, desire first and foremost God's kingdom and God's righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, stop worrying about tomorrow, because tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. May God add wisdom to the reading, hearing, and understanding of these words. So as I just mentioned, last Sunday we talked about giving up control as the first main sermon in this series. And we started digging into those behaviors that we ought to start giving up, or that we ought to give up during Lent, and also for the rest of our lives. As we talked about control, we talked about how as humans, we like to be in control, not only of our own lives, but even the lives of other people. We also talked about how trying to be in control is unhealthy and can lead to unhappiness. And that when we let go of our inclinations to micromanage our lives and the lives of others, when we let go of our perfectionist tendencies and relinquish control to our Creator, we will all be a lot happier and healthier, and the people around us will be better off as well. But even though giving up control is an important behavior that we ought to be giving up, it's not the only behavior. In fact, other behaviors that often cause harm include bitterness, apathy, and envy. All of these were brought up in chapter 1 of our Lenten study book that we looked at last week. And today, as we look at expectations, that's another behavior that we ought to be giving up. In May of 2002, our son Ryan graduated from high school. Both of our parents came to help us celebrate the event, but I noticed that my mom didn't look very well, and I told her so. And she said she shrugged her shoulders and said, "Oh, I'm just getting old." And she brushed me off. But just 2 months later, she was in the hospital with what they thought was acute myeloid leukemia, which is a type of blood cancer that requires aggressive and immediate treatment. As I was getting ready to fly to California to be with my mom the day that I heard that news, I received a second call from my dad. It wasn't AML after all, because the cells that they found in my mother's blood were also in her belly, which is impossible with AML. It took a couple of days before the doctors finally figured out her diagnosis. Turned out that she did have cancer. It was an estrogen receptor positive cancer, much like breast cancer. Her oncologist told us it was completely treatable, and he gave her a prescription for the medication she needed to take, and we took my mom back home. Our expectations, based upon what the doctor said to us, was that if she took the medicine, my mom would live a long and happy life. But 2 days later, she was back in the hospital. And they told us then that she needed to start chemotherapy right away. Her prognosis had changed from "she'll be fine" to "she might live 5 years or less." Needless to say, our expectations changed as well, but we still had hope that my mom would be with us for at least a few more years. But after just a few short weeks, I received the call, and my heart sank. When she was having trouble breathing in the hospital, they had drained some fluid out of her lungs, and they found the cancer cells there as well. And they believed that it was also, it had spread to her liver, and possibly even in her bones, which meant there was nothing more that they could do. So I flew to California that day and spent the night in the hospital with my mom. And the next day, right after lunch, she died. The first time that she had gone into the hospital when she was first diagnosed 2 months prior, we had not been told the full extent of her condition. Had we known, our expectations would have been different. And our decisions about her treatment plan would have also been different. Had we known that by the time my mom's cancer was discovered, just 2 months to the day before her death, that her cancer had already spread to her liver, her lungs, as well as her belly and her blood, we wouldn't have made her endure the chemo treatment that she did. But we didn't know. We didn't have the right expectations because we'd been given false expectations. Expectations are strong beliefs that certain things will happen in the near or distant future. They are often associated with the things we do, cause and effect. If A, then B. Expectations come to us from different sources, like our families, our friends, our peers, our bosses, even societal norms. But often we are the source of our own expectations. We expect a lot out of ourselves. And we expect a lot out of other people, which doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. Because expectations that are realistic and attainable can motivate us to do things well. And they can lead us toward more positive outcomes. But unfortunately, more often than not, the expectations we place on ourselves are the most unrealistic and the least attainable. They are often the hardest to meet. Generally speaking, we tend to expect more out of ourselves than we expect out of other people. And like I said, if those expectations are reasonable, they can guide us towards success. But when our expectations are unreasonable, when they're too high or too lofty or too difficult to achieve, they can lead us to all kinds of problems like stress, anxiety, depression, family problems, physical illness, even alcohol and substance abuse. For me, giving up expectations means giving up the stress and worry that unrealistic expectations cause. It means having faith and focusing on God. It means giving up expectations based on our human desires. It means trusting God so our lives will be more fulfilling. It means letting God lead us along life's journey, even though we may not know where we are headed or where we are going. We can rest assured that because of God's presence and guidance, we are headed in the right direction. But giving up expectations, especially those that are unreasonable and unattainable, is easier said than done, isn't it? How can we give up those expectations that damage and harm, that are unreasonable and unrealistic, whether we apply those expectations to ourselves or the people we love? Well, I'd like to make a few suggestions based on what I've read on that magic thing called the internet. First, we need to keep in mind that expectations are different from dreams and aspirations. Dreams and aspirations often are grounded in reality, and they can inspire us to do the things that are pleasing and productive in our lives. Expectations, on the other hand, often are not based in reality. When it comes to expectations, we expect that something will happen even though it might be unreasonable. We think that, and I think that's why we fail at meeting our own expectations, or that people around us fail to meet the expectations we have upon them. And that when that happens, it makes us angry and frustrated and resentful. That means that in most cases, our expectations were not reasonable. So we need to remember that dreams and aspirations are different from expectations. Second, in order to do something about our expectations, we need to identify what they are. So when you go home today, take out a pen and a piece of paper and make a list of the things that you expect of yourself. Make those statements short and sweet. Things like, I expect to be a successful artist, or I expect my house to always be clean. Now, if you're like most people, your list will probably be pretty long, which means it includes both realistic and unrealistic expectations as well. So then ask yourself about each item. Is this expectation something that I can actually accomplish? If I expect to be a successful artist, but I can't draw myself out of a paper bag, then chances are that expectation is not going to come to be. So I need to cross that off my list. Then, after you've done that, do the same thing, make a similar list about your expectations that you have for other people. Maybe your spouse or significant other, even your children. This might include things like, I expect my significant other to be at home on time. Or I expect my family members to help me with household chores. Like your expectations of yourself, this list is likely to be pretty long. So the next step then is to apply the golden rule to that list. You know what the golden rule is, right? Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. If you expect your significant other to be home on time, but you are often not home on time, it's unrealistic to expect to apply that expectation to them if you're not willing or able to do it yourself. So we would cross that one off the list. You might also put yourself in the other person's shoes. For example, if you expect your family members, including your children, to help you with the housework, but your kids are toddlers, chances are applying this expectation is unreasonable. So you might have to modify that expectation or cross it off the list. Now, by the time you're done, you'll have two lists. One with the expectations about yourself that you have for yourself, and one the expectations you have toward others. And hopefully what's left after you've crossed off the unrealistic ones is a list of things that are realistic, things that can actually be achieved. Now, this next step might seem obvious, but take a look at the expectations that you have crossed off of both of the lists. Those are the ones that you have to let go. You have to give them up. Because if you insist on applying an unrealistic or unreasonable expectation to yourself or toward another person, your life and your relationships will be unsatisfactory. Neither you nor the people around you will be very happy. And your life will probably be consumed with anger and conflict. And what about those expectations that you have not crossed off? Well, those which are likely to be realistic and reasonable, those are the ones you can act upon. Apply those expectations to yourself and to the people you love. But before you apply them to the people you love, have a conversation with them. Because in spite of the fact that you might think that something is a realistic expectation for them, they may not agree. So have that conversation and reach an agreement that you can both support. After talking about those expectations, you still might have to give a few of them up. And if you do, you need to just let them go. Don't worry about whether or not they will be met. You remember what Jesus said about worrying, right? Don't worry about anything, he said. Not the clothes you wear or the food you will eat. After all, the birds don't worry about their food, nor are they concerned with having clothes to wear. The lilies of the field don't work themselves to death, and quite frankly, neither should we. God knows exactly what we need. Jesus knows exactly what we need. And when we follow Christ, trusting him to lead the way, then we'll be able to give up the unrealistic expectations that no longer consume us, and we will live a happy life. In our Old Testament reading this morning, we heard about Abram and Sarah. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "Leave your land, your family, and your father's household. Go to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will make your name respected, and you will be blessed." Talk about your great expectations. If God had said that to any of us, I think we'd be off in a jiffy. We'd have all kinds of expectations about what might happen next. But Abram, the writer of Genesis doesn't tell us what Abram's expectations were, but we know that he was human. and as a human who was just told by God, no less, to pack his bags and get ready to move, I bet his expectations were pretty high. That God would do something amazing for him and his family. But Abram didn't know the rest of the story. He didn't know where he was going. All he knew was that he was going, and that God would show him the place where he would eventually land. He also didn't know that along the way he and his family would be detoured to Egypt, that Pharaoh would try to take Abram's wife Sarah as his own wife, or that Sarah would doubt her own part in God's promise that God would create a great nation out of Abram's descendants. And she insisted upon giving her maidservant to him, that they could lie together, and the two of them produced the heir that Sarah believed she could not produce because she believed she was barren. Now, I bet Abram's expectations were a bit like a roller coaster, but his faith in God never wavered, not for a second. He may not have known where he was going, but he knew that God would be with him. How many of you have a smartphone? Do you have a GPS on your smartphone? Yeah, I do too. I use it all the time. I love it because not only does it tell you, can you punch in the address and it'll tell you where you're going most of the time. Sometimes it dumps you off in a vacant lot. But it also, mine at least, tells me what the traffic looks like. And so it always gives me the quickest route, which I love. Well, once there was a couple that was visiting another couple who lived out in the country. And they were using their GPS to direct them to their friend's house. And as they twisted and turned through the backcountry roads, suddenly they lost their service and their GPS went dead. And so did their hopes of finding their way to their friend's home. But the man who was driving said, "Don't worry, I'm sure I can get us there." Right. Well, needless to say, they ended up getting terribly lost. And after driving around for what felt like forever, they finally found a payphone so they could call the person that they were trying to visit, and she gave them directions to her home. But when the time came for the couple to leave, the visiting wife became quite anxious and worried. How would they make it to the interstate? "Don't worry," her husband said, and then the wife of that they were visiting said, "It's okay, I got this. My husband will direct you to get you to the interstate. You just need to follow him." And so they did, until the local man made a left-hand turn and the couple kept going straight. "What are you doing?" the wife said to her husband. "Oh, I don't need to follow him anymore," the husband said. "Besides, he's going the wrong way. I can get us to the interstate." And to that his wife replied, "Why in the world won't you follow the one who knows where he is going?" The man stopped the car, and after thinking for a moment, he turned his car around and headed back to the corner where their host had turned left. And sure enough, they found him waiting there for them to return. And yes, the visiting couple made it back to the interstate because they followed the one who knew where he was going. My friends, we have our own divine GPS. It's called the God Positioning System. And we can use it to discern whether our expectations are reasonable or not. We can use it to help us give up those unproductive and unrealistic expectations so that our lives will be happier and healthier and more focused. Because when we follow the one who knows the way, who walks with us through the valley of unreasonable expectations, we can give up worrying. We can give up being frustrated. We can give up being angry because God has helped us give up those expectations. Amen.